Hello, lovelies. It's been a couple weeks, but I wanted to do a review of Chernobyl, the 5-part HBO miniseries. It's been a couple weeks since I finished it, but I just wanted to give some thoughts, some impressions, in case you were interested in pursuing this. Overall, I will say that the documentary is very good in terms of plot driven, okay? If you want a story as to how this event unfolded, how this happened, people involved, parties involved, the effects of acute radiation syndrome, you want to see that. Also aspects with decontamination and what they had to do to the neighborhoods, and then inevitably the result. This would be something to watch. It's going to give you a good summary, okay? It has an excellent cast. Let me begin with that. Jared Harris, he's always been a favorite of mine. He's always sort of a bit of a character actor. I'm not seeing him in many roles where he's necessarily the lead. The first time I saw him was actually in the film Sylvia, 2003. That film came out. He played the writer A. Alvarez. And then his father is Richard Harris. He's the son of the Richard Harris who was in This Sporting Life and also Antonioni's Red Desert. So I have always enjoyed him, and he is fantastic in this film as Valery Legasov, who is an inorganic chemist, and he's there to do the kind of investigation on the Chernobyl. And the series begins with his suicide. 2 years, and this is true to 2 years to the date of the event. He hangs himself, and the series goes back, and it details exactly how it unfolded. Now, having said that, we begin in episode 1. We see a lot of the kind of bureaucrats, and we see a lot of the egos involved. They want to run this test. They say that we need to get this test done. It's mostly for promotions to make themselves look good, but they're not. The people who are on the night crew are not properly trained. They are following instructions, but they are technically doing everything right. And as a result, the reactor, the core of reactor 4 blows up. And that's where you get this emission of this uranium, cesium. This stuff is absolutely unforgiving. And, it's very interesting because I have actually worked with radiation. Not this shit. But in one of my very early jobs, I did work with P32, but that has a half-life of 30 days. It's nothing like this. But it's still, it's not something you should still play with. It's not candy. And this stuff, though, it really got me thinking of a lot of philosophical kind of ideas, because it's like, radiation, it's not personal. You're just in its way. It's there, and it's tearing apart the molecular structure or the atomic structure of whatever it comes in contact with. Flesh, metal, it doesn't matter. It's unforgiving. It's indifferent. You're just in its way. It also got me thinking, there's radiation on Mars. No one sits there and thinks it's so terrible, because no one's affected by it. It just is, right? So it's doing what it just does. But if you're a life form, you're human, you're an animal, you're a tree, this is not good for you, okay? Obviously. And I've always actually been fascinated by isotopes. I was a biology major, but I actually really loved inorganic chemistry, and I was very interested in this. I mean, granted, if I was working with radiation, I who knows if I'd still be here now, right? But I always just found this so fascinating. So this was very interesting to me. It's also, I remember the event. I remember the event when it happened. I remember seeing the news reports. I was like 10 years old at the time. You know, I didn't yet know or understand the gravity of the situation, but I remember hearing about it, and then I remember, like, in science class we talked about it. But this paints a bigger picture. Okay, so episode 1 is really just the night it happens, and nobody really knows what's going on. They're downplaying the radiation. They're basically, you know, saying, oh, all these we call them Geiger counters, the readers, they're all broken. Well, no, it's that they've maxed out because there's so much fucking radiation. But it's very sad to see how the first responders showed up, the firemen and whatnot, and they, you know, ended up dying, putting out a fire. And you think about it, you're putting out a fire. You cannot put out a fire of radiation. All you're going to do is make radioactive steam. You need to use sand as well, and as I've read up and as said in the series, boron. And they didn't know that. So all these people ended up dying, these first responders, of his acute radiation symptoms, sickness, and it, you know, it goes through this whole, it just guts you, it liquefies you, it destroys your bone marrow. It's just, like, you know, I said, unforgiving. And so really that's the first episode, is the night it happens and immediately after. And then I will say episode 2 and 3 somewhat, I think, blend together. What stands out in episode 3 are the miners and their funky attitudes, and, you know, they have this sort of sense of duty about them, and they know they have to get this done. There's several moments in the film where they have people volunteer to do this life-threatening, whether it's draining the pipes, and in the episode 2, or the miners going underneath to dig, and they're not allowed to have fans, so you actually see them naked, and that's real. They really did. They were like, screw this, and they're, you know, they're like, what does it matter? We're rolling around in dirt, radioactive dirt. It doesn't matter. So you could have actually had an entire film just on the miners, I thought. But there's a lot of ethical questions that are posed, like, can we risk the lives of these few men to save the lives, essentially, of millions of people? It's presented that if the radioactive water forming a lava, they go through this whole process, it would form a lava, it would poison the sea. If that does that, if the sea gets poisoned, thus rendering Eastern Europe uninhabitable for 50,000 years. You know, this is serious. So something has to be done. And it's one of those questions, because I wondered, how did they get the miners to do this? And they're just like, well, you know, at that point you're like, I gotta do this or not, and or else all these people will die. And at that point you're like, all right, hope you put up a statue in my honor, something to remember me by, but all right, I'm doing it, okay? And then I will say episode 4 involves Liquidators, and they're going to, it's a very painful episode to watch. It's involves pets, and they have to kill the pets of the people, the abandoned pets, and it is very hard to watch. I will say that is one of the best episodes. I would say episode 1 and episode 4, and it's not because it was necessarily so emotional, but there's really some great exchanges between the older Liquidator and the young boy, and trying to get him to understand, like, it's, you know, when you commit these acts, it's still you, and it's questions about identity, and when you carry these things out, does it change you? And those are very interesting exchanges. Also, episode 4 has a scene where, I'm gonna link to it, where they go on the roof, okay? They have to go on the roof and dump the graphite over into the reactor in order, because they're going to build, you know, they have to shield this, because if they don't, it's just going to fume over, you know, thousands of years. So they have men going on this, and they're only supposed to be up there for, according to the film, it's 90 seconds, and you know, they wanted to do robots. They wanted robots to be up there, but the radioactivity destroys the microchips, so they couldn't get those to operate. This was their only option. So they have these men go on there, very short period of time, dump the graphite. I think they cleaned it up in 2 days, but again, many of them died young, many of them got cancer. You know, and it's again fascinating the way this radioactivity works, is that it attacks you on your atomic level. So it essentially is ripping apart your DNA. You have an unbalanced, you have an isotope, you have an unbalanced number, atomic number, and like anything in nature, it's trying to balance itself out. So you're in its way, it's gonna pull things from you. You know, it's gonna, it's pulling, you know, ripping you apart. I mean, that's why it just makes me think that so much of this, it is so sad when you go back to episode 4 and you think these animals have to die. I mean, so much of this is just human stupidity. Episode 5 explains a lot more of that. It explains actually the reaction that happens. Jared Harris, Valeri, goes into detail with regards to how this happened. They hit the button, the stop button, and it was supposed to cease the reaction, but he explains that there was graphite which accelerated it, thus causing this explosion. And they did it to save money. There's also interesting existential questions. They say, there's one line in there, they say, this whole event, they say, this is so humbling with, you know, the radiation. It humbles you because no one's immune to it, right? And another actor, can't remember who, he responds, no, it's humiliating. And I think, from what I understand of the Soviets, that this was a very humiliating thing. They were embarrassed. They did not want to admit the incompetence. They didn't want to look like idiots to the world. So, so a lot of it was downplayed. Okay, so overall, what I'm trying to say, I know I'm kind of all over the place. I didn't take very many notes. I just wanted to wing this. But this is a very good plot-driven miniseries. Has nice little moments, especially like episode 5. You see Stellan Skarsgård, Emily Watson. She's also very good. Stellan Skarsgård. He's sitting there and he has a little green caterpillar on him, and it just shows a nice little moment of the flourishing of life, despite the fact that he's coughing up blood. And the series shows the evolution of the French, you know, the relationship between Valeri and Boris, and how in the beginning they hated each other. By the end, you know, they're kind of learning a respect for each other, and how this tragedy kind of literally ripped people apart, but brought them together. And there's a nice line where Emily Watson is listing the names of the deceased, and she says they died trying to save one another. And it's a very powerful, you know, it's somewhat detached, I think, because it's covering so much over 5 episodes, but it's thorough in terms of giving you a broad picture. As I said, I do think that if you focused on one little aspect of it, probably would have been maybe a more artful film, but it certainly wouldn't have covered the broad spectrum, which is what most people want to know. We want to know what happened, right? Some of the criticisms I will say is that the boss of, because episode 5, you go back to the first episode. It tells a flashback. It explains that night where the boss is saying, you need to do this, and that the employees are undertrained, and they're saying, this just doesn't make sense. They're forced to carry out these executions with instructions that have been crossed out. And he says, I don't care, do it anyway. He comes off as such an asshole, and he's so, you can't really empathize with him because he's so, I mean, in a sense, it's almost like, a Hollywood bad guy. These are the bad guys. And that was my only criticism. It doesn't delve too much into it. I mean, yes, you get their egos, you see their narcissists and such, but it doesn't cover so much into really their characters. But, but keep that in mind. This isn't a Tarkovsky film, and it's not trying to be. It doesn't have to be. But overall, I found it a very rewarding experience. I'm glad I watched it. I probably, in enough time, will watch it again and listen to more of the podcast, which I have not listened to. Maybe I'll have some more insights once I do, but just wanted to step back a little bit and think about it for a little while before I gave some thoughts. But that's what I have to say on that. So hope everyone else is doing well. It's a nice Friday afternoon, and that's about all I got. I'll be in touch soon. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.